All right. Welcome everyone who's here today for the launch of Steve Hanson's extraordinary book, A Shaken Bible, just published in the Beyond Criticisms edition book series by Boiler House Press. I'm Thomas Karshan from the University of East Anglia, and I'm a member of the editorial board of Beyond Criticism, along with Katie Craik from Oxford Brookes University and Simon Palfrey from Oxford University. And I'll be joined this evening, I am joined this evening, by the author of the book, Steve Hanson, and also by Steve's respondent, Andrew Shanks, who is Canon, Emeritus Canon Theologian at Manchester Cathedral, and the author of numerous works on a range of topics, among other things, Hegel and theology. The Beyond Criticism book series is a new initiative dedicated to publishing books which in many different ways are both creative and critical, those much vexed, complicated terms. We aim to discover new forms for new thinking about literature, and we want to break down false divisions between scholarship and imagination. We believe that to think critically is to think creatively, and to think creatively is to think critically. If you're interested, please do visit our website, which is simply beyondcriticism.net, where you'll find a manifesto for our series, contact details for the editors, and details of other books currently being published, as well as links to the two launch events which have already taken place. One for Simon Palfrey and Ewan Fernie's novel, In Response to Macbeth, which is titled Macbeth, Macbeth, and one to Ansgar Allen's The Sick List, a fictive critique of the modern university. You'll also find details of the one final launch, which will take place at this same time at 5 o'clock, next Thursday, June 24th, which is of Robert Crawford's book, Textual Nonsense, a teasing send-up of modern university lit crit and its institutions. And you will also, of course, be able to buy the books on our website, which I imagine you may well want to rush off and do after this event, especially Steve's, but not only. There will also, within a couple of weeks, be an accompanying website, creativecritical.net, which I'm going to be editing. So if you're interested in reading shorter material, both about writing and teaching in the creative critical vein, please look out for that. And if you're interested in proposing material, please be in touch with us through that website. We have a Twitter handle, which you can follow Creative Critical, Beyond Criticism at, which is just Beyond Crit. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank a number of people, above all our four brilliant authors, and especially tonight, Steve, the author of the remarkable book we're going to be celebrating, reading from and talking about this evening. And I also want to thank the staff of Boiler House Press, who have published a series of 4 extremely elegant, striking, beautifully produced books, and managed with aplomb all aspects of the launch of the series. Among others, Nathan Hamilton, the publisher artisan, Brad Bigelow, who's brought a military precision to getting the series up and publicized, and Shannon Clinton Copeland, who's masterminded the launch events. So we're going to begin this evening with Steve introducing his book and reading from it. And then Andrew is going to talk about the book and some of the ideas and some of the context. And then there's going to be a trialogue between us of various of the voices which are woven into, transcended, sublimated, contravened, controverted, and arguing with each other in the pages of Steve's remarkable book, before there'll be a discussion between Steve and Andrew, which I'll be hosting. At the end of the session, around 6:15, there should be time for some questions and answers from the audience. So please do put any thoughts and questions you have in the chat as we go along over the next hour. The way we're doing that has to be a little bit circuitous. So I'm going to need some time to gather up those questions. So please don't be shy of putting your questions and comments in the box as we go along this evening, so that they're there in good time. So At this point, I'm now going to hand over to Steve himself, the author of this extraordinarily powerful and moving book, which we're very proud to publish.
Thank you, Tommy. I'm Steve Hansen, and I'm here to talk about this, this book put out by Boiler House Press and Beyond Criticism. It's quite a complicated object with an already a fairly long history, so I'll try to be as clear as possible about what it is, but with a warning up front that that's going to be, a slightly difficult thing to do. So, I assume Tommy will steer me in the right direction and give me a prod if I seem to be going off script, if there even is a script. The first thing I want to do, though, is just to read you a little section of the book. What it is really is a kind of a collage of sections of the King James Bible, quite a bit of the Old Testament, but it also brings in 17th century figures such as the Ranters, particularly Abba Zakot, who we'll talk about a little later, people like Blake, Joseph Salmon. So it really is a kind of a mixed up set of voices, largely from the 17th century. And the voices that I've pulled into the book have all kind of share a particular tone, which, myself and Andrew will no doubt talk about as we go on. So I'll begin with a little section. So this is the end section of A Shaken Bible. Branding. Their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed innocent blood. Their thoughts are thoughts of iniquity. Wasting and destruction are in their paths. The book of Jasher burns. The way of peace they know not, and there is no judgment in their goings. They have made them crooked paths. Whosoever goes therein shall not know peace. Therefore is judgment far from us, neither doth justice overtake us. We wait for light, but behold obscurity. Look for brightness, but we walk in darkness. We grope for the wall like the blind, and we grope as if we had no eyes. We stumble at noonday as in the night. We are in desolate places as dead men. We roar like bears and mourn sore like doves. We look for judgment, but there is none. For salvation, but it is far off from us. For truth is fallen in the street, and equity cannot enter. Vexations of the tongue, but the keeping on. Let me, my son, in his gate. Bitterly you hold in his gate. At one double hour, the darkness was dense. It did not allow him to see. In his face, the bull spat slaver with the tuft of its tail. As they say, the knife at 2 double hours. It did not allow him to see. A chair of lapis lazuli, a staff of lapis lazuli. That exists, I know indeed. Why do you desire to do this thing? Out, do you want so much? At 5 double hours. At 8 double hours, he was hurrying. At 9 double hours, the north wind. 1 reaching 10 double hours was very near. There was brilliance. The trees. She lifted her head in order to watch him. Elaine double hours, the deluge. The darkness was dense. Let me. Hypocrites become neocrites. Suppose a woman has and loses. Light a lamp, sweep the arse and search carefully until she finds it. So the reason I picked this little end section is actually because it's fairly easy to explain what's being collaged in this little bit here. So the first section that you hear, their feet run to evil and onwards, is from the book of Isaiah 59:7, the King James. Although if you actually read it on the page, it looks quite strange. And I'm going to explain a little more about the strangeness as we go on. So there's quite a lot of Isaiah in there. What you get at the end, which is much more poetic, that I finished on, an abridged section, is how the Shaken Bible ends. It kind of drifts off into a semi-conscious sort of meditation. And that material is taken from the book of Gilgamesh. Now, the volume that I've got has got sections and sections of the original clay tablets from Gilgamesh, and these quite technical and very faithful renderings of some of the smashed sections. So here we are. So when I saw these, I became very interested in how, I mean, firstly, they're already kind of enjambed like poetry. There's this ellipsis going on, which reminded me of things like saline even, you know, they've almost got a kind of a modernist poetry feel to them. So that end section started to become a collage of those two things, really, Isaiah and some of the, you know, literally the ruins of the legend of Gilgamesh. There's also a reference in there to the book of Jasher. Now the book of Jasher is reportedly an actual lost book of the Bible, which we don't have anymore. But in Bristol in the 18th century, I think early 18th century, there was a fake book of the Bible created and presented, which got its printers executed, I believe, fake book of Jasher. Now you can actually get hold of the fake book of Jasher and you can read it, and it is a counterfeit. But what I started to become interested in the fake book of Jasher is how the things that got the printer and the author into great trouble were actually seemed to be the things that were true. So there were, you know, the voices which railed against iniquity, landlordism, and, you know, various, you know, kind of terrible injustices of the time. So, I mean, I mentioned those things because the voices that I've kind of concentrated into this book really have a very particular tone, as you'll see if you eventually read the whole thing. So that's just a little taste of the book. So if I talk a little bit now, I think about the history of it and the backstory, because actually I realized just kind of looking back and preparing for this talk that the work was actually finished about 6 years ago in 2015. So it's already quite old, really. Now, a year before that, in 2014, I was kind of, I suppose, writing a lot, journalism, kind of left-wing journalism, reading a lot of it. I was working in higher education, in the humanities, in art schools. But I was getting a little bit disconnected from that work and getting quite disconnected from some of the left-wing voices, which I was finding to be quite nostalgic. You know, some of the far left articles were starting to recycle Soviet imagery and memes and all those kinds of things. And I was quite generally, I started to become disenchanted with that. And I was also starting to wonder why. I mean, I've got an art school background. My teaching is in, kind of art school and cultural studies, cultural and contextual studies, really. I started to wonder why there was a real lack of attention to the formalism in much of the material that I was reading. Okay, so that's about 2014. In 2015, I was late 2014, actually. I was in a really bad house fire, which put me out of action for the best part of a year, really. And I was lucky to get out of it. But as a consequence of that happening, I was basically kind of blown back to the Calder Valley from which I came originally. I grew up in the Calder Valley in a little place called Walsden, near the town of Todmorden, essentially to recover. And I think I was, getting quite good at not really going out and doing anything. And a friend of mine, very good friend of mine, Mark Rainey, who's really quite important to this work, as is his father, David Rainey, who's a lay preacher who Andrew knows. Mark kind of dragged me out of my murk and took me to a conference up at Durham, which was a celebration of the life and work of Gillian Rose. So I went up there with him, and I think Andrew was speaking there, actually. Andrew will probably remember it was quite, I think it's fair to say, a lively event. So there were, by midday, I think one academic had been literally kind of chased out of the room over various, points of theology. So it was quite an interesting event. Anyway, after the event, I returned to Todmorden, and sort of not having a great deal to do, I started to look at some of the material that had been discussed at the conference, and I started also to look at the King James Bible again for the first time in a very long time. And I started to pick, the first thing I did was to start to pick out individual lines in the Bible that I thought were incredible. And I almost, in a sort of hobbyist way, tried to put together a little anthology of quotations. I kind of collect these. This is my copy of Grigson's Before the Romantics. I like a nice anthology of quotations. So that's one largely from the 18th century. But as soon as I started to do this, to pull together bits and pieces of the Bible, I started to become increasingly enveloped in it and its world, really, and particularly its form. I think the first thing that happened was there are some sections which are divided by semicolons in the King James, and essentially they ask a question, place a semicolon at the end of the question, and then effectively kind of answer the question for you. So I thought, what if I take out all the semicolons? So I did. So, I mean, you can do this on Word or whatever, word processing software you use, is to use the find change function and to just remove them all. And then I started to look at this section again, and immediately what you've got is a different proposition altogether. It seemed less dogmatic, less like it was trying to teach you a moral lesson. So I started to kind of strategically work through the book and to do various things to it each day. And I was kind of happily medicated and able to do this for 10, 11 hours a day at that point, and was written off work. So the second thing I did was to take, what if you take the word God out of the whole thing, which you can do in about 12 seconds. So, I mean, one important thing to say about this work, I think, and I mean, if there are former students of mine here will kind of recognize this, is in my teaching, I always want to demystify. So, I mean, actually, the making of this book was largely a series of formal exercises which anyone can run, and I would encourage people to run them and to make this kind of experimental work. So yeah, the word God came out of it, after the whole thing. I also then started to simply and quite brutally redact the book, taking out anything that really just didn't speak, that I thought didn't speak to our times quite directly. I also started to find sections which spoke to each other, even though they were in different books, and I started to put those together. I started to do research. At this point, I think I was in touch with Andrew. So I was talking to Andrew about some of the history of the Bible. Andrew told me that the chronologically, the first book of the Bible really is the book of Amos. So straight away, out came Genesis and in went Amos. So the reordering started from this point. I was also interested in disrupting or removing the kind of invented teleology of it. So Genesis went to the middle of the book, or versions of it. I mean, there are only fragments of it left in the book. It's been processed so heavily. So I was quite interested in a quote by Deleuze, which says something like, "We are always already beginning again from the middle." So I wanted the book to have a slightly different feel in terms of time. So for you to be in a kind of constantly collapsing present, a big middle. And actually the work of Gillian Rose and her book of the broken middle is important, but I want to avoid talking about that now because it's just going to get very complicated, unfortunately. So that, I mean, I'm trying to explain how I started to write this strange thing, and what the impulses were. And I think a wider impulse, as I've kind of hinted at now, was kind of looking at critical writing and writing about our times and thinking, well, why isn't it interested in formalism? Why isn't it formally innovative? And also seeing a lot of voices which went back to the post-war period and were kind of nostalgic about the post-war left, and then kind of almost saying, well, if you want to go back in time, why not do this? Why not go all the way back to the 17th century and to, the voice of Amos, who, I guess Andrew will talk more about Amos, but, the prophet Amos comes out of a life of shepherding in order to go and raise a series of issues with the local priests, during which he makes prophecies, many of which don't come to pass. But I think, the voice in Amos is a voice which rails at iniquity in his time. So basically, around the time Amos was preaching, there were a series of wars, and the supply chains were breaking down around him, and there was no fat of the land, basically, and all of the lean was being consumed by the priesthood. So Amos goes to the temples and he tells them that judgment will rain down upon them. So, I mean, in a strange way, I was thinking about the era of austerity during which I wrote the book. I mean, my book before that was about small towns and austerity, and the way in which, the kind of the language of the left, or the critical voices that I was hearing, weren't really, I didn't feel they were strong enough. And actually, when I read Amos and when I started to read voices like Abby Zakok, I thought, well, those voices are strong enough, actually. So why don't I revisit some of that? So,
Steve, maybe you want to tell people who Abby Zakok was.
Oh yeah, that would be useful, wouldn't it? Okay, so Abby Zakok was one of the ranters, one of the, they weren't, I believe, not really known as the ranters in their time. It was a little bit after that they were grouped together and called the ranters, but they were essentially kind of early nonconformist preachers, Ebenezer Cop, Joseph Salmon, and they were operating around the time of the Civil War. So you just had the Levelers and the Diggers and Winstanley. All those quite utopian movements had really been put down, and the Puritans were in power. And Cop, unfortunately for him, wasn't really in a great deal of favour with either the Royalists or the Puritans at the time. And he wrote a series of pamphlets that were published, the first one being Fiery Flying Roll, some of which is, kind of meshed into this book, Shaken Bible, I've produced. And it put him in prison for a few months. He was inside a couple of times, actually. But the second time was the most serious, and he was put inside for having published Fiery Flying Roll. He writes letters from prison, which we have copies of. Some parts of one of those are in the Shaken Bible also. And he essentially had to write his way out of prison. Salmon also had to write his way out of jail by publishing a kind of a recantation of his blasphemous opinions. Salmon did it much better. He wrote what seems like a fairly genuine one. Cop managed to throw a few more blasphemies into his apology as well, and got out of prison and died in obscurity. But the work itself, I think, of Cop, I started reading, I'd had this for years and years. It was sent to me by a good friend of mine, Steve Pescott, just out of the blue. He worked in the printer that published it, and I started tracking down quite a few of the others. But when I started to work on a Shaken Bible, or the first version of a Shaken Bible, I should talk about that. It seemed to me like the Cop voice, the Ebenezer Cop voice, and some of the other ranters, despite being utterly scandalous individuals, had a kind of a tone to what they were saying, which sat quite well with Amos. So I think when we read the three-way section in a while, we're going to get a little bit of Amos, a little bit of Cop, and then a kind of a fused section of that. I hope all that makes sense.
Steve, can I ask you to just talk to everyone a little bit about the Yorkshire Lancashire dialect that you've transfigured the King James Version into, and what that dialect means to you and your sense of its history, and the force of that?
Yeah, I mean, people who've been reading the kind of the invites to this talk and everything might be surprised that my accent isn't that strong really, but my family's accents are very strong. My father's got a very strong kind of Lancashire Yorkshire accent, and I was lucky enough to know my great grandfather, a man called Fielding Newell, who was around for World War One and all of that. And actually his voice, which I still remember very well, was all thee and thou and thine. And it had in it, all of that kind of 17th century religious inflection. And it was very strange, obviously, to me, because, I didn't see him very often. But when I did, this man would come in who spoke in this very, very markedly different way. And when I started writing this book, I was kind of blown back to where I was from. I was living with my folks, and I was walking around a tiny little loop around their house, which I'm writing about that loop now for other reasons, which I won't go into because it really will get too confusing. But I think that voice and the way that it kind of is used locally to speak about things, it's a minor it's a kind of a minor language. I mean, Deleuze and Guattari talk about minor versus major languages, and how there's a slave discourse and a master discourse. We could get into the Hegel here, and how forms of speech like Cockney or Patois are have it's not their full function, but part of their function is to evade the hearing of the overseers, if you like, So, I mean, I think those accents, as I grew up with them, I mean, I worked in some of the last factories in the Calder Valley. I worked in Mons Mill, which is flattened and is now houses. I worked on John Deere tractors on Fordist assembly lines. That was the voice, and the bus ride home was full of dissenting voices in a very extreme accent. My father worked at a place called Woolsden Printing, which again, I could spend all evening telling you stories about the language and all of that, but it became quite important to me to have it partly in that accent and in that voice. So I think the main, just at the level, on the granular level of the text, one of the main things that I did, again with the kind of fine change function, although I couldn't do it all en masse, is that there are two spellings of the word there in this book, just to give you an example. So there's there, which is T-H-E-I-R, and then lots of the other ones are T-H-I-E-R, there. So go up there, right, So hopefully that, when people are reading the book, they will speak it in their heads like that. I think the other thing to say, though, actually, is now I've gone back to the book. I don't think, other people might completely disagree with this, but I don't think that the accenting in the book is that extreme. And I get a sense that actually, when I was putting it together, I did want everybody to be able to read it, really. And also for people to be able to ignore the accenting and to read it out, in a less provincial accent, if they wanted to.
Would
so
that
it works in both senses, in both.
I think that's just such an important point to come in on, that transformation of the King James into this dialect, which you think of as a kind of a minor language, or So I wonder, Steve, would this be a good moment to bring Andrew in?
Yes, definitely.
To place Steve's work in that broader context of rewritings and transformations of the Bible.
It's always a good moment to bring Andrew in.
Thank you. So this book is entitled A Shaken Bible. I thought I'd say something about the shakenness of Steve's work and about its biblical nature. That's to say something about Steve's return to the King James Version of the Bible in English and its whole original cultural ambience as part of the inspiration for a contemporary prose poem. To digress for a moment, throughout the past century, of course, there have been many attempts to supplant the King James Version with more up-to-date translations of the Bible, basically aiming to render it more accessible. And Tommy wanted me to tell you this little story about that. I'm a priest, and once upon a time, I looked after a cluster of churches on the North York moors. Tiny churches, perpetually open, they had no keys. And there was one in particular, a lovely medieval building, serving a community still quite feudal in ethos. When I celebrated Holy Communion, it was always the elderly local lord who read the gospel, because he was the Lord. The others would actually have preferred for him to read from the King James Version. They were conservative types, and there's partly a conservative attraction to the King James Version. But no, he was an enthusiastic evangelical. And the version he read from was The Message, the translation by Eugene Peterson, an American evangelical scholar. And there's a passage in the King James Version where, you may remember it, Jesus says to his disciples, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing? And one of them shall not fall to the ground without your Father, but the very hairs on your head are all numbered. Fear ye not, therefore, ye are of more value than many sparrows. That's Matthew chapter 10, verses 29 to 31, and Luke 12, verses 6 to 7 is a variant upon it. Other modern versions besides Peterson's make it, are not two sparrows sold for a penny, which still does sound quite cheap, but otherwise they just modernize the grammar. Peterson, however, is bolder. He has, what's the price of a pet canary? Some loose change, right? We stood in a little medieval church and we heard the words of Jesus saying, what's the price of a pet canary? Because I guess in the pet shops of modern America, you won't find sparrows for sale as songbirds, you'll find canaries or perhaps budgerigars. Anyhow, the point is that when it comes to the Bible, what Steve is doing is the opposite extreme to what Peterson is doing. He's going back to the King James Version because what he's aiming at isn't accessibility. At least this is my understanding of it. Making the text easier to approach. No, no, no. On the contrary, what he's aiming at is shakenness. As it were, exploring the latent, poetic power of the text with all its associated troubled history to shake us out of all comfortable familiarity. But then, that's how the Bible began. I mean, in shakenness. As Steve remarked, the first book of the Bible, in the sense of being the oldest, it isn't Genesis, it's the little book of the prophet Amos. The book has evolved a little bit in history, but substantially it was written in the mid-8th century BC. You can tell that because the predictions it makes are false, and who, if they were going to write it later, would have included false predictions. The opening pages of a shaken Bible are full of snippets from Amos, which is a poetically very rich, a wonderfully sublime text, which expresses precisely an intense shakenness, an intense pathos of shakenness. Amos is full of the most incandescent, scathing, divine rage against economic injustice. Steve is such a gentle man, so polite, so easygoing, but in this book, he's tapping into fury. Set aside the legends of Abraham and the other patriarchs, set aside the legends of Moses and the Exodus. All those legends, as we have them, were written down long after the days of Amos. Before Amos, there's no real evidence that the sacred practices of the Hebrews were essentially different in kind from the sacred practices of their neighbors. What do gods want? Before Amos, everyone knew the answer. It was obvious, of course. What gods really want, all of them, what they really want is flattery. But the God of Amos, in a fury, says, no, don't flatter me. What I demand is not flattery. It's justice, it's righteousness, the rich repenting, the poor treated right. No God had ever spoken like this. Amos represents a completely new, impassioned, egalitarian spirit with terrific poetic power. The book of Amos is a great earthquake. It dates itself in the opening verse with reference to a literal earthquake, but it is in itself a cultural earthquake. And it's therefore deeply, deeply problematic. Most of the rest of the Bible may be read precisely as a series of attempts to cope with the elementary problem in question. How do you create a viable worshipping community on this disruptive basis, this infinitely demanding ethical imperative, the utter negativity of this rage? How can it all hold together? What would a truly effective form of solidarity building liturgy look like, which doesn't just tend to flatter God? In a sense, it's a problem with which Jews and Christians and Muslims have been wrestling ever since the mid-8th century BCE. And it's a problem which still to this day remains unresolved, a primordial broken middle. If we, and here I say we meaning the devout, I'm a priest, if we want to spread our faith, make converts, then yes, we do need to make Holy Scripture, Bible or Quran as accessible as possible. What's the price of a pet canary? I'm not against Peterson's project. He does it with a certain flamboyance, splendid. But if we want to maintain our ethical integrity at its most shaken and so authentic, that's surely a matter of trying to reconnect with what I'm inclined to call the Amos impulse. The earthquake of Amos sends follow-up tremors all through the Bible and through Abrahamic tradition as a whole. In this country, there was a big tremor in the mid-17th century at the time of the Civil War. Abiezer Kopp is one who registers it vividly, anarchically. And then again, in the period of the early Industrial Revolution, there's the tremor which William Blake registers likewise anarchically. Both Kopp and Blake, along with all their respective contemporaries, were, of course, working within the religious literary environment primarily built upon the foundation of the King James Version. And this, as I understand it, is why Steve is going back to the King James Version. And now, look, here's another work of spiritual seismology along something like the same lines, which to me makes it rather interesting. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, both of you. Now, what we're now going to do is put these is in a way dissolve the shaken Bible back into some of its original voices, some of its constituent voices, and to allow those voices to resonate against one another. So Andrew is going to begin by reading out certain sections of the book of Amos in the King James Version. And then I'm going to begin, and then I'm going to read out a passage from the 17th century ranter Abiezer Kopp, who we're discussing. And then Steve is going to read out from the opening of the Shaken Bible, which borrows from those voices. Over to you, Andrew.
So, yes. These are little passages from Amos in the King James Version, which are all of them part of the mix in the opening pages of A Shaken Gospel. And first of all, I'm just going to read you one verse, chapter 1, verse 1, the epigraph. So these are the words of Amos, who was among the herdmen of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. There's the earthquake. And now here's a surreal, raging, poetic picture of the aristocratic women of the northern Hebrew kingdom of Israel. They oppress the poor, their cows, their fish, they're hooked, they're hoiked out of the ruins of their mansions. Hear this word, ye kine of Bashan, that are in the mountain of Samaria, which oppress the poor, which crush the needy, which say to their masters, bring and let us drink. The Lord God hath sworn by his holiness that, lo, the days shall come upon you, that he will take you away with hooks, and your posterity with fish hooks. And ye shall go out at the breaches, every cow at that which is before her. Amos is not a polite prophet. He refuses to be silenced by the rich, whom he denounces in this passage, chapter 5, verses 10 to 14. They hate him that rebuketh in the gate, and they abhor him that speaketh uprightly. Forasmuch therefore as your treading is upon the poor, and ye take from him burdens of wheat, ye have built houses of hewn stone, but ye shall not dwell in them. Ye have planted pleasant vineyards, but ye shall not drink wine of them. For I know your manifold transgressions and your mighty sins. They afflict the just, they take a bribe, and they turn aside the poor in the gate from their right. Therefore the prudent shall keep silence in that time, for it is an evil time. Seek good and not evil, that ye may live. And so the Lord, the God of hosts, shall be with you, as ye have spoken. And then chapter 5, verses 21 to 24. This is a key passage. I've said that the God of Amos rejects flattery, and here it is. He's speaking, this is God, the God Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, talking to his people. He says, I despise your feast days, and I will not smell in your solemn assemblies. Though ye offer me burnt offerings and your meat offerings, I will not accept them. Neither will I regard the peace offerings of your fat beasts. Take thou away from me the noise of thy songs, for I will not hear the melody of thy viols. But let judgment run down as waters, and righteousness as a mighty stream. And finally, God again threatens the rich with retribution and also foretells the coming of a great hunger for the sort of prophetic truth which Amos is here initiating. This is chapter 8, verses 4 to 12. Hear this, O ye that swallow up the needy, even to make the poor of the land to fail, saying, when will the new moon be gone, that we may sell corn, and the Sabbath, that we may set forth wheat, making the ephah small and the shekel great, and falsifying the balances by deceit, that we may buy the poor for silver, and the needy for a pair of shoes, yea, and sell the refuse of the wheat. The Lord hath sworn by the excellency of Jacob, surely I will never forget any of their works. Shall not the land tremble for this, and every one mourn that dwelleth therein? And it shall rise up wholly as a flood, and it shall be cast out and drowned as by the flood of Egypt. And it shall come to pass in that day, saith the Lord God, that I will cause the sun to go down at noon, and I will darken the earth in the clear day. And I will turn your feasts into mourning, and all your songs into lamentation. And I will bring up sackcloth upon all loins, and baldness upon every head. And I will make it as the morning of an only son, and the end thereof as a bitter day. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord God, that I will send a famine in the land, not a famine of bread, nor a thirst for water, but of hearing the words of the Lord. And they shall wander from sea to sea, and from the north even to the east. They shall run to and fro to seek the word of the Lord, and shall not find it.
Thank you. I'm now going to read from Abiza Kopp. Thus saith the Lord, I inform you, that I overturn. And as the bishops Charles and the lords have had their turn overturn. So your turn shall be next, ye surviving great ones. By what name or title soever dignified or distinguished, whoever you are that oppose me, the eternal God, who am universal love, and whose service is perfect freedom and pure libertinism. But before I proceed any further, be it known to you, that although that excellent majesty which dwells in the writer of this roll hath reconciled all things to himself, yet this hand which now writes never drew sword or shed one drop of any man's blood. I am free from the blood of all men, though I say all things are reconciled in me, the eternal God in him, yet sword leveling or digging leveling are neither of them his principle. Both are as far from his principle as the east is from the west, or the heavens from the earth, though I say reconciled to both as to all things else. And though he hath more justice, righteousness, truth, and sincerity, shining in those low dunghills as they are esteemed, than in the sun, moon, and all the stars. I come not forth in him, either with material sword or mattock, but now, in this my day, I make him my sword bearer, to brandish the sword of the Spirit, as he hath done several days and nights together through the streets of the great city.
Okay, so I'm going to read this a section from the very start of Shaken Bible, which fuses essentially the Amos voice and the Cop voice, and then it's been, processed in terms of having, an accent. All of the double letters have been taken out of it, etc., etc. Leaving. Hear this word, ye kine, that oppress the poor. There is a famine i' the land, not a famine of bread, nor a thirst for water, but of hearing. At 5 double hours, the darkness was dense. It did not allow him to see. He leaves thereafter. There the venturer leaves the blooded. Hypocrites, neocrites. After dipping the sop, he leaves and seeks the troubled priests i' the church of the tent maker. One followed to draw him back. I was that one. He would not draw back, but have me seek refuge with him, that I might take what burned in his heart. And we gained sanctuary. And we sat, and he spoke. And they shall wander from sea to sea, and from the north e'en to south. They shall run to and fro to seek, and shall not find. Hear this, O ye that swallow up and crush the needy, make the poor to fail, falsifying balances by deceit. What time is this, that we may buy the poor for silver, and the needy for a pair of shoes, yea, and sell the refuse of the wheat? Nay, he will take you away with hooks, and your posterity with fishhooks. Your treading is upon the poor, and ye take from him burthens of wheat. You have built houses of hewn and stone, but ye shall not dwell in them, not one of you. Ye've planted vineyards, but you shall not drink, not one. I know your manifold transgressions. They afflict the just, they take a bribe, and they turn aside the poor i' the gate from their rights. Shall the prudent keep silence in that evil time? Seek good and not evil, that ye may live. They shall call the husbandman to mourning, and such as are skillful of lamentation to wailing and more. Yet the onion has many layers, and see. Think on this. But still, let judgment run down as waters thus, and righteousness as a mighty stream on they that lie upon beds of ivory, and stretch themselves upon their couches, and eat the lambs out the flock, and the calves out the midst of the stall. Not enough salt for thee tears here. They that chant to the sound of the viol, and invent of themselves instruments of music, that drink the wine in bowls, and anoint themselves with chief ointments, they are not grieved for the affliction. I hate, I despise your feast days and solemn assemblies. Though ye offer meats, I will not accept of them. Neither will I regard the peace offerings of your fat beasts. Take thy away from me the noise of thy songs, for I will not hear the melody of thy viols. Fancy music for few ears. The earth will darken in the clear day. I will turn your feasts into mourning, and all your songs into lamentation, and I will bring baldness upon every head, and I will make it as the morning of an only son, and the end thereof as a day of sharp biting. Therefore now shall they go captive, and the banquet of them that stretch themselves shall be removed to no fancy musics. Though they dig into hell, thence shall mine hand take them. Though they climb up, thence will I bring them down. I will set mine eyes upon them for evil and not for good. Though they hide from my sight in the bottom of the sea, though they belong there, thence will I command the snake bitch Ananke, and she shall bite them all. I will give your skulls a cleanness of teeth. I have smitten you with blasting and mildew, and your gardens, and your gardens.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Andrew. That was extremely powerful, I thought. I wanted to ask the two of you to begin with, what happens when those voices are set one against one another? What do those voices mean to you? And what happens when the King James is transfigured into that dialect?
Well, I think the main thing that I wanted to do in processing the book in a really, in a fairly simple way was to make you look at it again, to refresh it, to make it new again by making it strange, basically, as Andrew's alluded to. So I mean, the books had, there was a version of this that came out in, I have to even remind myself, 2016, I think, and it was called A Book of the Broken Middle. So there was a kind of a bigger reference to Gillian Rhodes, which, I mean, we could talk about that or not. So it came out as that. But I think the whole urge to process it in the way that I did process it was to break apart the kind of, there's a sort of aura to the King James as it is, particularly the quite familiar passages, the ones that people know, the ones that are quoted a lot, the ones that, you know, are constantly kind of churning around the semiosphere on the internet, on social media, that really closes them off from a proper appreciation or scrutiny of what's going on. So really, I wanted to break it open again. So I think just at the most simple level, that's what I'm trying to do with the processing. It might be worth saying actually that there was a version of this book before it came out via this little press in just 100 copies. That wasn't. I mean, one of the final changes I made to it was to take all of the double letters out of most of the words. So the word letter would only have one T in it in the world of the Shaken Bible. I'd actually signed a contract with Repeater Books to deliver a kind of materialist Bible before I decided to make that change. And I went back to them with it changed, and they were, I mean, they're great people, and Tariq Goddard, you know, we agreed to go our separate ways very amicably, and they said, you know, well, we can't sell this thing in W.H. Smith's Travel, you know, and I said, well, I appreciate that completely, and but I knew that I needed to make the book as strange as it will appear to you if you start to read it, in order not to make it clearer, because that's wrong, but actually to allow you a way back into some of this material, you know, because some of the much more familiar King James material is very, very, it's kind of drained of its aura in a way, through familiarity and repetition. Same with Blake as well, actually. Copp's not so much of a problem because he's still not very well known. But Blake, you know, after Hubert Parry and Jerusalem, after many Tate retrospectives, you know, lots of the lines of Blake are hidden to us by familiarity, if you like. So I had to break that familiarity. That was the first job. And I can't, as I've explained, I kind of started doing that just out of curious experimenting, which is, you know, part of my practice as a writer. And again, why I think it's found this home in Beyond Criticism. When it went to Beyond Criticism, to yourself and Catherine and Ewan Fernie was involved, Simon Parfrey, also John Shadd at the time, you know, they seemed to understand that it was appropriate to be in that kind of creative critical world. And actually, when I started writing it, I didn't know that the creative critical was a thing at all. But of course, other people were feeling the same as I was about critical humanities and all of that. So it was very appropriate. It was very appropriate for that project, I think. And again, like seeing the openings, the launches of the books. I read Macbeth, and I was interested in some of the things that Simon Palfrey was saying at another launch a few weeks back about how, you know, there's this kind of what he called desperate forms of mimetic desire in a lot of academic writing, which is, you know, grounded by footnotes, grounded by referencing. You know, I kind of wanted to just do something which was just swept that to one side. You know, and this isn't to say there's not good work being made in the standard academic frame, because there's absolutely brilliant work being made within that frame. But I think, you know, the whole creative critical project is really fecund, you know, in terms of people making these interventions that are formal, and allow, you know, the big thing that I wanted to do with this was to allow other people to come after me and to make other pieces of work. I mean, I've just put another book out, a poetry collection called Proceedings, and there's another further riff on Amos in the last section. So I'm still kind of processing it and still experimenting with it, and it's open-ended and it's ongoing. So I mean, the other thing that the King James is a final thing, you know. It's in this early edition of the book, one thing I did at the start was, you've got a Book of the Broken Middle and this strange, slightly sinister looking object there, like a black hole. That's actually the final full stop of my version of the King James, my Oxford copy, scanned and then blown up as far as I can get it. And of course, it doesn't look very full stop-ish anymore once you do that. So it's almost a kind of an exemplification of what I'm doing to the text, is that if you blow it up, you know, figuratively and literally, you can then look at the pieces afresh. And the other thing I did at the start of this book is it's got the scanned instance of amen, but I've knocked the A off. So then you're just left with men, with humans, which is a similar formal strategic move, I think, to taking the word God out. And really, Andrew might want to talk a little bit about this, but he's mentioned in the preface how it's aligned with negative theological traditions because of that, those removals.
Why don't we pick up and move on, hear from Andrew now? I mean, Andrew, my original question was about these voices resonating with each other, but we've brought in these questions about the defamiliarization of the King James and the making it shaken again and making it shocking again. And Steve's already brought in this question of the broken middle. So I just wonder if I can throw all those things at you and you can pick out whatever you want to start with there.
Yeah. I'm thinking about the liturgy and the one of the great advantages of Amos as a book is it has very little presence in either Christian liturgy or rabbinic liturgy. Very little indeed, considering it seems to me it's the most important book in the Bible in the sense that it sets the terms for all the rest. But you wouldn't get that by attending the liturgy. There is, in a way, to Christian theology, Amos is reduced to this one line: let judgment run down as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. I think Barack Obama cites, uses this in his speeches and so forth. But generally speaking, this absolutely, this extremely acerbic book, it's too acerbic to be easily taken into liturgy. And I think in rabbinic liturgy, I may be wrong about this, but my understanding is that it's present, but not very, very rarely. And it's a surprise to people that it has the importance that it has. And this is clearly, from the point of view of poetry, a poetic renaissance, or the project that Steve is embarked on. This is a huge advantage. And there's a lot else in the Bible to which the same thing can be done, because it's also because the bits that we remember, they're a very small selection, a very small percentage. And it is a new genre that he's inventing, and I hope other people also explore it.
Me too.
I mean, it is, and yet it's so continuous with the whole of the history of secular literature, which, so much concerns transfigurations of the Bible in various ways, reworked quotations, reinvention, a collaging together of bits of the Bible along with classical literature, a transformation of those sentiments into new languages, and so on. And all of that, could be conceived of as a shaking. So I just wondered about the relationship between this and, the phrase we are using coming out of English departments, which is the creative critical, which doesn't really map so directly necessarily onto this text, but has a kind of interesting tension. I mean, criticism, of course, has a particular meaning in relationship to Bible studies, going back to the late 17th century, the teasing apart of the authentic from the inauthentic. but that sense is continuous with, you know, the emergence of criticism as a word in literary discourse. And as for creation, in the sense of literary creation, that's much more a romantic concept. I just wondered how the both of you felt that concept of the creative critical did or didn't really map onto this book. Are there ways in which you think this rewriting is shedding new light on the Bible or on the King James Bible, or unearthing things in it which are otherwise unclear? And are there ways in which that critical act is continuous with the new creation?
I mean, I know, Tommy, and you've got a copy of this, which has got like an extended essay in the back of it. And I think I had to revisit that because it's 6 years old now. And I think when I did the original version, I had in my head this idea that, you know, I wanted to offer a shaken Bible to the humanities. You know, if we're doing, you know, like cultural criticism, do it like this. You know, it was almost a sort of slightly, you know, punk statement to make, I suppose. And it was wrong, actually, you know. And I think when I took it to the Beyond Criticism team initially, you know, they could see that really, in terms of its uses, it's a prism, really, I think, the book. And eventually, when I worked on the final version, I tried to think more about it, and to think of it as a prism, really. So it depends who reads it. I mean, lots of people are going to take themselves through this book and go to very different places with it. I mean, it's not very helpful, is it? This is because, I mean, obviously there's that happens with modernist literature. It happens with quite abstract poetry. But it's this breaking apart and opening up and offering out again, I think, that's my critical intention. But, you know, once it's out there, the book is up for grabs for anybody, I think. So it's up for grabs for the creative critical. It's up for grabs to, you know, the theologians. It's up for grabs to whoever, you know, and critical in terms of whether they think it's a success or it's absolutely horrible or whatever. I think it's, you know, it's got an independent life of its own. And actually coming back to it after a few years, I had to break back into it, you know. It's like a vehicle I've made and I've lost the keys for. So,
Sorry, Steve, please.
No, well, I did make a lot of notes at the time, which are in the back of this early version. And then I think, you know, there's an essay that might come out on the website, which has got some of those changes that track what I actually did to it, you know, in a quite a practical sense. But can
I put the same question to Andrew? I mean, coming from a theological background, that phrase creative critical may make a lot of sense to you or no sense at all. Do you think it maps onto Steve's work? What do you make of that?
In this sense, we're talking about in relation to the creator with a capital C. We theologians are interested in that. And Steve has taken the creator, his name at least, the name of the creator, out of the Bible. And my job as a theologian is to struggle to put it back in, but to put it back in outside any cliche, outside any familiarity. So it is this critical energy that's present in the poem is precisely what reciprocally must energize theology. It's precisely that energy which must energize theology in the sense of a negation of the negation. I want to negate what Steve's doing. Absolutely, I want to negate it. But I need it to be as negative as possible, and it is.
I mean, I think you're absolutely absolutely right on one of the underpinnings, which is, Frankfurt School and Adorno, but also coming out of that Gillian Rose conference that I went to, that you spoke at. It's an act of negation. The whole thing is an act of negation, and the Frankfurt School are really, a very key philosophical school for me. And I've just started reading. Polity have just put out Adorno and Gershom Scholem's correspondence translated into English, and I've not got very far into that. But obviously, what Adorno was a theist at all. He was not part of that world. He was also distant from particular kinds of Marxism as well, and certainly after World War II because of his experiences. But actually what's interesting about the correspondence between Scholem and Adorno, and the connecting point is Walter Benjamin, obviously, is that Adorno, it took him a long time to work out what he did think about it, but he certainly thought that the older traditions were part of the struggle into the future. I mean, just looking at that correspondence. So I think, Andrew's right about, the negation of the negation. And I think it's completely legitimate that then somebody should take this and then put the God back in it. I mean, that's, that's one thing that they can do with it, but that's one of many things that hopefully they can do with it. And I think, to make it as useful a cultural object as possible, it needs to have that kind of prism-like function, which can be useful. It can make it quite fecund in terms of it having multiple meanings for lots of people, but there are also dangers to that as well, I think. I mean, I've been just saying to Andrew before we went live that I've been watching some of the anti-vax things, and that guy chasing the journalist shouting traitor, and I mean, I thought about COP when I saw that, So I mean, there are dangers with bringing these voices out, and there are also dangers with making them very abstract and very interpretable. And I'm very aware of that. But I mean, I'm hoping that this book will be viewed as, I mean, my personal intention for it was to bring back the voices of Amos and COP as a scream against, austerity and its ongoing effects on the communities in which of which I've been a part when I was growing up. So I mean, that's very simple and straightforward. But actually, the book will the book itself will make my intentions irrelevant, and rightly so. But as put the God back in it and start from that absolute bottoming out of it as a piece of extreme negation with quite a lot of rage in it. The whole point of that, we might talk about Hegel and we might talk about all of those things in dialectic, is that then goes somewhere else. Those tensions then, can force this thing to move somewhere else, and it needs to. No one can stay in. You can't stay in that headspace of a shaken Bible for very long, I don't think.
Yeah.
Please, Andrew.
I mean, it's the same with the prophet Amos. Hebrew culture could not stay in that headspace for very long. One generation, less than one generation, and the second great writing prophet of the tradition, namely Hosea, appears, whose project is quite different. He wants to be faithful to the God of Amos, but he also wants there to be built an authentic community. Amos is a total loner. He's totally sociopathic in his passion for truth. Hosea is trying to create a project that will unite a liturgical community around that same God. I'm a priest, and I believe in what priests do. And what we do is we try and build community. And we try and build community inclusive of people of every different level of education, people of every different class. In principle, that's what we try and do. People of every different opinion. around something quite intangible. It's preserving that intangibility that is the problem. But yet, trying to create a space and build a space in which people very different from each other meet each other and talk with each other and talk about the deepest things with each other. And that's what reintroducing the name of God would serve to do. That's the reason for doing it. It's not a matter of metaphysical belief. It's a project of bringing people together. God's a focus. That's what the creator does. He creates community by creating the world.
Yeah. And I think that's so, the word create came back in there in what Andrew was saying, not just in relationship to artistic creation, but in relation to the creation of stable structures like Hosea and community, whereas Steve was moving towards that word fecundity, which has much more to do with dissemination and the shaken and the uncontrollable meanings, which are dangerously uncontrollable. But I do think that Steve also has created this kind of wild, intangible thing, which has drawn us together into conversation this evening from our three quite different backgrounds. I wonder, Steve, if you would like to round the evening off by giving us a final reading.
Yep, sure thing. So let me see. The magical object. He broke silence again. Mystery, cosmos, vast infinity. What shall I say thou art when thou canst be named? What shall I speak of thee when in speaking of thee I speak nothing but contradiction? For if I say I see thee, it is nothing but the seeing of thyself, for there is nothing in me capable of seeing out but thyself. I see with your eyes. If I say I know thee, that is no other than knowledge of myself. For I am of thee. If I say I love thee, it is nothing so. My seeking of thee is none other than the seeking of myself. My delight in thee is none other than delight in myself, in inconceivable ways. As all things were let at thee, so they shall give up their being, life, happiness, misery, into thee again. Though the clothing dissolve and come to nothing, thee liveth on, and I, 'tis clear, live in thee, cosmos, Ionata. One single, uncompounded and unseparated glory in whose intrinsical womb variety lies occult, till time orderly brings it forth. I lie quietly secure in the silence of infinity, at this crossing in many roads. While I see the whole world consumed in the fire of envy, one again the other, I hear much noise about me, but it serves only to deafen me, and on into the still slumbers of the infinite. The formal world is much affrighted. Every form is up in arms to proclaim open wars upon itself, dashing one thing agin the other, that which he formerly faced with the glory of his own presence, he setteth up and casts down, and who shall say, what doest thou? While we perambulate in variety, we walk but as so many shadows or ghosts in it, that itself being but the umbrage of unity. To descend from the oneness or eternity into the multiplicity is to lose ourselves in the endless labyrinth. To then ascend from variety to unity would be to find ourselves as we were before we were. But how shall a man attain a oneness? Seeing there is no way probable for us, we must patiently expect its seasonal descension upon us. Whose name is it to consume us unto itself, melt us into the same nature and likeness? And truly, until this comes to manifest, all that man does to acquire full satisfaction does multiply sorrow on his head and augment cares on his spirit. Dark is the path of others for the one that fled his own. I sometimes hear from the world, which I have now forsaken. I see its diurnals are fraught with the tidings of the same clamour and strife which abounded when I left it. And mine own past presents clues, traps on the waves to be plucked and read. I give it the hearing, and that is all.
Thank you, Steve. That was really powerful. Thank you very much. And thank you, Andrew. So that's everything for this evening. Thank you to those of you who joined us. And don't hesitate to snap up your copy of the book by going straight to the beyondcriticism.net website after we close off. So good evening to all of you.